She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply slid the $5 bill back across the table and said, "Sir, kindness isn't measured by how much you give. It's measured by how you treat people when no one is watching." The restaurant noise continued around them, forks against plates, quiet laughter, the smell of butter and garlic hanging in the air, but at that table everything stopped. The billionaire stared at the bill as if it had accused him of something. His fingers trembled slightly before he pulled his hand back. In that instant, something in his expression shifted, like a door inside him had been forced open. That sentence would follow him home, echo through the quiet halls of his mansion, sit with him in the dark of his bedroom, and by morning, it would begin rewriting a will worth billions. Before we uncover why this stranger left only $5, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now ask yourself, what could make a man who owns private jets and skyscrapers test a waitress with $5? And what was broken inside him that her words struck so deeply? 12 hours earlier, he had walked into that restaurant alone. Daniel Harper was a name that appeared on the covers of business magazines and financial reports, a man who built a logistics empire from a single warehouse in his 20s into a company valued in the billions. But that night, he wore a simple navy jacket and drove himself instead of using a driver. He chose a quiet neighborhood diner instead of the five-star establishments that usually competed for his presence. Why? Because 3 weeks earlier, his only daughter, Emily, had stood in his office with tears in her eyes and told him she was leaving the foundation he funded in her name. "You write checks, Dad," she had said softly. "But you don't see people." The words had irritated him at the time. He believed generosity was measured in numbers. Endowments. Buildings. Scholarships. But since that conversation, something restless had been sitting in his chest. So he decided to test a theory. If kindness could be measured, then he would measure it. The waitress who approached his table introduced herself as Claire. She looked to be in her early 30s, her hair tied back neatly, a small silver necklace resting against her collarbone. There was a faint tiredness around her eyes, the kind that comes from long shifts and little sleep. Yet when she smiled, it was genuine. "What can I get you tonight, sir?" she asked. Daniel barely glanced up. "Coffee. Black." His tone was flat. No greeting. No eye contact. Claire nodded politely and returned with the coffee within minutes. He noticed her movements were efficient but gentle, never rushed despite the busy dinner crowd. When she refilled a child's spilled drink at the next table, she knelt to the boy's level and whispered, "It happens to everyone." Daniel watched all of this silently, his mind calculating. He decided he would push further. He ordered the most expensive steak on the menu and asked detailed questions about preparation, sending it back once for being slightly overcooked. Claire apologized, though it was clear the mistake came from the kitchen. "I'll fix it right away," she said, her voice steady. As the evening continued, Daniel became more demanding. He requested extra napkins, then a different glass, then asked why the music was too loud. Claire responded each time with patience that did not feel forced. At one point, he caught a glimpse of her hands trembling slightly as she carried a heavy tray, and he wondered how many tables she was covering alone. He remembered Emily volunteering at shelters during college, coming home with stories of families who worked 2 jobs yet still struggled. He had dismissed those stories as emotional exaggerations. But watching Claire, he sensed something familiar in her quiet resilience. When the check arrived, the total was $127. Daniel placed $5 on the tray. Less than 4%. He did it slowly, intentionally, and waited. This was the experiment. Would she react with anger? Disappointment? Would she ignore it? Instead, Claire looked at the bill, then at him, and gently pushed it back. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "if there was a problem with my service, I'd really appreciate knowing." I try my best. Daniel met her eyes for the first time that evening. There was no accusation in them, only sincerity. You did your job, he replied coolly. That's what you're paid for. Claire inhaled softly. For a moment, he thought she would walk away. Instead, she said the sentence that would change everything. Kindness isn't measured by how much you give. It's measured by how you treat people when no one is watching. She wasn't lecturing him. She wasn't pleading. She was stating something she believed. And then she added quietly, I have a son at home who thinks the world is fair because I tell him it is. I'd like to keep believing that too. There it was. A detail he hadn't expected. A child. A belief in fairness. The experiment had produced something he hadn't calculated. That night, Daniel returned to his mansion, a place of glass walls and echoing corridors. The housekeeper had left fresh flowers in the foyer. The lights turned on automatically as he walked through. Yet the space felt unusually hollow. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. Instead, he sat in his study where a draft of his will lay inside a leather folder. For years, he had structured it meticulously. The majority of his fortune would go to a charitable trust bearing his name, managed by executives and advisors. Emily would receive a comfortable but controlled portion, released in stages. He believed discipline built character. But as he stared at the numbers on the page, Claire's voice returned to him. Kindness isn't measured by how much you give. He thought about all the times he had written massive checks without ever meeting the recipients. He thought about Emily's disappointment. He thought about the way he had looked at Claire as if she were invisible. Have you ever realized too late that you were measuring the wrong thing? What would it feel like to discover that your generosity had been missing something essential? By 2 a.m, Daniel found himself researching wage statistics for tipped workers in the United States, something he had never done before. He read that many servers rely heavily on tips to meet basic expenses. He calculated how far $5 would go toward rent, groceries, or a child's school supplies. The math unsettled him. At 3:30, he called his attorney, leaving a voicemail requesting an urgent meeting at dawn. I need to revise the will, he said simply. He didn't explain why. When morning light crept through the windows, he hadn't slept. Instead, he drove back to the diner before his office opened. The same neon sign flickered above the entrance. Inside, Claire was wiping down tables. She looked surprised to see him. Is everything okay, sir? She asked cautiously. Daniel approached slowly, holding an envelope. I owe you an apology, he said. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. He placed a check inside the tray, this time for $10,000. Claire's eyes widened. I can't accept this, she whispered. Daniel shook his head. It's not about the amount, he replied. It's about what you reminded me of. Claire hesitated before saying, if you want to make a difference, there are families here who could use steady help, not just one big moment. That response surprised him again. She wasn't dazzled by the number. She was thinking long-term. Daniel felt a shift in his perspective, subtle but powerful. He asked about her son. She told him his name was Lucas, that he loved science and dreamed of building rockets. He thinks I'm a superhero because I work nights, she said with a small laugh. Daniel imagined a young boy waiting up for his mother, believing in fairness because she taught him to. Something tightened in his chest. Before he left, he asked Claire for permission to support a local scholarship fund anonymously. She agreed, on one condition, that he visit and meet the students. See them, she said. That's the part that matters. 6 months later, Daniel stood in a modest school auditorium as the first group of scholarship recipients were announced. He had restructured his will entirely. Instead of a distant trust managed by executives, he created community partnerships that required personal involvement. Emily returned to work alongside him after seeing the changes. What happened? She asked one evening. Daniel thought of the $5 bill sliding back across the table. I was reminded that respect costs nothing, he answered. Claire continued working at the diner, though with fewer night shifts after Daniel funded a childcare program in the neighborhood. Lucas received a science kit that Daniel delivered himself. The boy's eyes shone with excitement. There was no publicity, no press release. Just quiet impact. And now, I want to ask you something. If you were in Claire's position, would you have spoken up? Or would you have accepted the $5 and walked away? And if you were in Daniel's place, would your pride have allowed you to return the next morning? Sometimes the smallest confrontations reveal the deepest truths about who we are. One sentence, spoken calmly across a table, redirected a fortune and reshaped a legacy. Daniel still keeps that original $5 bill in his desk drawer as a reminder of the night he learned that generosity without humanity is incomplete. The will was rewritten, yes. But more importantly, so was the man who signed it at the other end of the city. Long before that $5 bill ever touched the table, Lily Carter was finishing her second shift of the day. 32 years old, single mother, and permanently tired in a way sleep never fully fixed. The diner's fluorescent lights had left a dull ache behind her eyes, and the smell of fried onions clung to her sweater as she stepped into the cold evening air. Her phone buzzed with a reminder she had set 3 days earlier: rent, final notice. She didn't open the message. She already knew what it would say. 3 months behind. 1 more week before eviction proceedings. Her car had started making a grinding sound every time she turned the key, and twice that week she had prayed it would start because missing work was not an option. Yet when she walked through the small apartment door, she didn't bring the exhaustion inside with her. "Hey, champ," she said softly, forcing a smile. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his math homework spread out beside a half-empty glass of milk. He was 8 years old, thin for his age, with bright eyes that carried more awareness than most children should have. An inhaler rested near his elbow, always within reach. "Mom, I got a B on my spelling test," he said proudly. Lily leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "That's my genius." She hung her diner apron on the back of a chair and moved to the stove to heat up leftovers. The kitchen light flickered slightly, a reminder that the electricity bill was due too. On the refrigerator door, held by a worn magnet shaped like a sunflower, was the sticky note she couldn't ignore: "Don't forget rent, final notice." The landlord's handwriting was bold and impatient. Lily glanced at it, then quickly looked away before Ethan could notice. Have you ever tried to protect a child from a storm while standing directly in the rain yourself? Later that night, after Ethan's coughing fit eased and he drifted off to sleep, Lily sat at the table with a calculator and a notepad. She counted tips from her apron pocket, smoothing out crumpled bills as if pressing them flat could somehow stretch their value. $47 from the morning shift. $62 from the evening. It still wasn't enough. She whispered to herself, one more good week. Just one. There was no bitterness in her voice, only determination. She thought about picking up another shift, though her body already felt like it was running on borrowed energy. Quiet dignity defined her. She never complained to customers, never snapped at coworkers, never let her worry spill into her service. When guests asked how she was doing, she always answered, "I'm blessed." Not because life was easy, but because Ethan was asleep in the next room, breathing steadily for now. Across town, in a glass and steel home that overlooked the river, Henry Caldwell stared at a different kind of silence. At 68, the reclusive tech billionaire had everything money could construct and nothing it could repair. His company had revolutionized data security, turning him into a household name in financial circles. Yet the headlines rarely mentioned his wife, Margaret, who had passed away 18 months earlier after a brief illness. The house had felt colder ever since. Her piano remained untouched in the corner of the living room, sheet music frozen on the last song she practiced. Henry often paused there at night, his fingers hovering over the keys without pressing them. Grief had carved something hollow inside him. His children, both adults with families of their own, visited less frequently now. Conversations about inheritance had replaced conversations about memories. "Dad, you need to think about the future," his eldest son had insisted during their last dinner. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that the future they meant was measured only in assets. Betrayal had not arrived dramatically in his life, it had accumulated slowly. Business partners who leaked confidential strategies. Friends who disappeared when investments failed. Even extended relatives who surfaced only when rumors about his estate circulated. Over time, Henry stopped trusting gestures of kindness. Donations brought public praise but private skepticism. Smiles often felt transactional. And so a question began to haunt him: was genuine kindness still possible in a world that knew his net worth before his name? He stopped attending charity galas. He reduced public appearances. Security teams waited outside wherever he went, but that particular afternoon, he told his driver to take the day off. "I'll manage," he said quietly. No cameras. No press. No announcement. Just a man in a simple coat walking into a roadside diner no one would associate with a billionaire. He chose that diner intentionally. It wasn't on any recommended list. It had cracked vinyl booths and a menu laminated so many times the edges had begun to peel. He sat alone, observing. Not the food. The people. A young couple splitting one plate and laughing as if it were a feast. An elderly man folding his newspaper carefully before leaving a modest tip. And then Lily, moving from table to table with steady patience despite the visible weight she carried in her shoulders. Henry watched how she refilled coffee without being asked, how she crouched to speak kindly to a restless toddler, how she apologized for a kitchen delay that wasn't her fault. He noticed the faint worry in her eyes when she checked her phone between orders, likely reading a message she wished she hadn't received. He wasn't looking for food that day, he was looking for proof that kindness still existed. But why would a man with private jets and philanthropic awards feel emotionally broken enough to test a stranger? Why walk in alone, without the protective shield of status, without the safety of being recognized? Perhaps because recognition had become the problem. When people know what you own, they treat you according to what they can gain. Henry wanted to know who people were when they believed no one important was watching. And so two lives, separated by wealth but connected by quiet desperation, moved steadily toward a single moment neither of them expected would change everything. One carried overdue notices and an inhaler. The other carried grief and suspicion. The question hanging between them, though neither had spoken it yet, was simple: if kindness were stripped of reward, would it still survive? Henry pushed open the diner door just after 6:10 p.m., the small brass bell above it giving a tired ring. He wore a faded brown jacket, the kind you could buy at any department store, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow his face. No driver waited outside. No assistant hovered nearby. If anyone glanced at him, they saw an older man with expensive posture but ordinary clothes. He chose a booth near the corner, one that allowed him to see most of the room without being obvious about it. When Lily approached with a menu, he noticed the faint crease between her brows, the kind that forms when someone is constantly calculating. "Evening," she said softly. "Coffee?" He nodded. His voice was calm, neutral. "Black." She smiled politely and moved on, already turning toward another table before the word had fully left his mouth. Henry wrapped his hands around the warm mug when she returned, but he wasn't tasting the coffee. He was observing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Lily moved steadily from table to table. An elderly couple sat near the window, their dinner check resting between them like a small obstacle. Henry watched as the woman emptied a coin purse onto the table, quarters and nickels scattering across the surface. The man's hands trembled slightly as he counted. Lily approached, glanced at the pile, and without hesitation said, "Take your time." I'll help. She knelt beside them, separating coins into neat stacks. You're short by $2, she said gently, then lowered her voice. It's okay. I'll fix it. She adjusted something on the receipt before they could protest. The couple looked embarrassed. Thank you, sweetheart, the woman whispered. Lily only smiled. It's just pie and coffee. You're good. Henry's jaw tightened slightly. There was no performance in her tone. No glance around to see who might be impressed. She simply stood and carried on. Another 10 minutes. The dinner rush intensified. Orders stacked up in the kitchen window. A younger waitress approached Lily near the counter, whispering urgently, I can't stay late. My babysitter cancelled. Lily didn't hesitate. Go, she replied. I'll cover your tables. The coworker frowned. You're already on a double. Lily shrugged. It's fine. Henry watched her tie her apron tighter and pick up 2 extra order pads. She moved faster now, but her voice never sharpened. When a truck driver in a worn denim jacket sat heavily at the counter, rubbing his eyes as if sleep had been a stranger for days, Lily poured him coffee without being asked. Long haul, she guessed. He nodded. 3 states. He stared at the menu, then at his wallet, hesitating. Lily disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with a slice of apple pie. On the house, she said quietly. You look like you need it. The man blinked in surprise. I can't, you can, she insisted gently. Just promise to get some rest. Henry watched. 5 minutes. 10. 15. She never changed for anyone. Whether it was a family splitting one meal or a loud customer snapping about cold fries, her tone remained steady. No sighs when she turned away. No muttered complaints under her breath. At one point, the same coworker who had left earlier returned to grab her purse and paused beside Lily near the soda machine. You're too soft, she whispered. People will use you. Lily paused only for a second before replying, her voice quiet but firm, maybe, but I'd rather be kind than right. The words landed softly in the air, but they struck Henry with unexpected force. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't nodding in approval. He was remembering someone. Years earlier, in a kitchen far warmer than this diner, Margaret had stood barefoot on cool tile floors, telling him something similar. He could see her clearly now, flour dusted on her hands as she baked bread on a Sunday afternoon. Henry, she had said, laughing lightly when he complained about a business partner who betrayed him, don't let other people's choices harden you. He had dismissed it at the time. The world isn't built on kindness, he'd replied. Margaret had wiped her hands on a towel and looked at him with patient certainty. Maybe not, she said. But our home is. The memory surfaced now without invitation. The curve of her smile. The softness in her conviction. And then the hospital room 18 months ago, the steady beeping of machines, her hand weaker in his. Promise me, she had whispered, you won't let disappointment turn you into someone unrecognizable. He had promised. But somewhere between board meetings and legal disputes over his estate, he had drifted far from that version of himself. Back in the diner, a man at a nearby table raised his voice over a minor mistake in his order. This isn't what I asked for. Lily apologized immediately. I'm sorry, sir. I'll fix it. There was no sarcasm. No defensive tone. She replaced the plate within minutes. When she returned to collect the incorrect dish, Henry noticed the exhaustion in her shoulders deepened slightly. For a brief second, as she turned toward the kitchen, her smile dropped. Her face relaxed into something more honest, tired, worried, human. Then she inhaled slowly and lifted her chin before stepping back into the dining area. That small private moment caught Henry's attention more than anything else. She allowed herself exactly one breath of vulnerability before returning to composure. He found himself wondering what waited for her after this shift. What bills? What responsibilities? What silent fears? An hour passed. Henry ordered a simple meal, observing how she treated him the same way she treated everyone else. No extra charm. No indifference. Balanced, respectful service. When he asked for a refill, she brought it promptly. When he remained quiet, she didn't push conversation. She seemed to read people instinctively, adjusting just enough without losing herself. And still, Henry's expression remained serious. Because the more he watched, the clearer it became, she wasn't performing kindness to earn approval. It was woven into her behavior, even when it cost her time, energy, or money. That realization unsettled him. Could someone still live this way without expecting anything in return? Or was there something he hadn't yet seen? As he reached into his wallet later that evening, preparing to place a deliberate $5 bill on a much larger check, his heart wasn't steady. It was conflicted. He told himself this was just an observation. Just confirmation. But beneath that logic was a quieter truth: he was about to test more than her character. He was about to confront his own. Henry finished his meal slowly, deliberately, as if stretching time would make the decision easier. The plate in front of him was nearly clean, the last bite untouched. Around him, the dinner rush had softened into scattered conversations and the low hum of a tired evening. Lily moved between tables with the same steady rhythm, refilling cups, wiping counters, stacking plates. Nothing about her demeanor had shifted. Nothing had cracked. Henry reached into his wallet and paused for just a fraction of a second before pulling out a folded $5 bill. The check totaled just over $90. He placed the bill neatly in the center of the receipt holder, closed it halfway, then slid it to the edge of the table. His hand lingered there for a moment before withdrawing. His face revealed nothing. But his eyes stayed fixed on her. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Lily approached, her order pad tucked beneath her arm. "I'll take that for you," she said softly, lifting the leather folder. She opened it while still standing at the table. Henry watched closely. There was no dramatic reaction. No immediate frown. She simply stared at the $5 bill resting against the printed total. Her fingers hovered over it. For a moment, it seemed as though she might place it directly into her apron pocket and move on. Instead, she closed the folder gently and looked up at him. Not with anger. Not with accusation. But with quiet evaluation. She studied him carefully, as if trying to understand something beyond the money. Then she asked, her voice respectful and controlled, "Was something wrong with the service, sir?" Henry met her eyes. He could see exhaustion there. And something else. Pride. The kind that refuses to beg. He said nothing at first. The silence stretched between them, noticeable but not loud. A couple at a nearby booth laughed at something unrelated, unaware that something significant was unfolding just a few feet away. Lily didn't rush to fill the silence. She stood straight, shoulders squared, waiting. Henry finally gave a small nod. Not a convincing one. Just enough to suggest dissatisfaction. "Everything was fine," he said evenly. "Thank you." He reached for his coat. Lily held his gaze for another second, as if measuring the sincerity of that answer. She didn't challenge him. She didn't defend herself. But she also didn't step aside immediately. Instead, she opened the folder again and gently removed the $5 bill. She smoothed it between her fingers, glancing briefly at the receipt. $93 and change. $5. The math was obvious. Still, her expression didn't harden. She placed the bill back on the table, sliding it a few inches toward him. "Sir," she said carefully, "if there was an issue, I'd really appreciate the chance to fix it. Her tone was steady. Professional. But beneath it was something deeper, a request to be judged fairly. Henry felt a flicker of discomfort rise in his chest. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. There was no resentment in her voice. No bitterness. Only accountability. She was offering him the opportunity to correct his impression of her work. He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. "There's nothing to fix," he replied. His words were calm, almost detached. Lily inhaled softly, then spoke again, quieter this time but firmer. "Kindness isn't measured by how much you give," she said. "It's measured by how you treat people when no one is watching." The sentence settled into the space between them. Henry didn't respond. He couldn't. Because for the first time that evening, he felt exposed. She wasn't shaming him. She wasn't demanding more money. She was defending her dignity. And in doing so, she shifted the weight of the moment back onto him. Around them, chairs scraped lightly against the floor as other customers prepared to leave. Life continued. But for Henry, something had paused internally. He gave a final nod, one that carried more uncertainty than confidence, and walked toward the exit. The bell above the door rang again as it closed behind him. He didn't look back immediately. But once he reached the sidewalk, he stopped. Through the window, he could see Lily still standing by the table. She picked up the $5 bill again, holding it between her fingers. For a brief second, her composure faltered. Her shoulders dropped. She exhaled deeply. Henry watched her glance toward the counter where tips were pooled for the night. He could almost see the calculation happening in her mind. Rent. Groceries. Her son's medication. $5 wasn't nothing. It mattered. And yet, after a moment's hesitation, she placed the bill into the tip jar without expression and moved on to wipe down the table, as if refusing to let the moment define her. Henry turned away, walking toward his car. The cool night air felt sharper than before. His steps were steady, but his thoughts were not. The real test hadn't been about money. It had never been about money. It was about character under pressure. About what someone chooses when they are tired, stretched thin, and quietly struggling. He had expected irritation. Perhaps quiet resentment. Instead, he witnessed restraint. Integrity. A refusal to compromise self-respect for survival. And now, as he unlocked his car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, a question pressed heavily against his mind. What had he just revealed about himself? The door had barely finished swinging shut when the tension inside the diner released in a different direction. The younger waitress who had left earlier returned from the back room, tying her hair into a loose bun. She glanced at the nearly empty booth and then at the receipt still sitting in Lily's hand. "Let me guess," she muttered, loud enough for the cook behind the counter to hear. "Cheap old man." Another coworker chimed in from the register, "Probably broke. Or just one of those guys who think servers don't deserve real money." A short laugh followed. It wasn't cruel laughter, just tired laughter, the kind people use to cope with disappointment. Lily didn't laugh. She kept her eyes on the folded bill resting between her fingers. "Hey," the younger waitress added, stepping closer. "How much did he leave?" Lily hesitated before answering. "$5." The coworker whistled softly. "On that tab?" "Wow. That's cold." The cook shook his head. "Some people just don't get it." Lily gently placed the receipt book on the counter and smoothed the bill again, almost absent-mindedly. Then she looked up, her voice calm but firm. "Maybe he's struggling too," she said. "We don't know his story." The register clerk rolled her eyes. "Struggling?" He didn't look like he was struggling. Lily shrugged slightly. "Looks can lie." There was no defensiveness in her tone. Just a boundary. And in that small defense of a man who had just undervalued her effort, something quietly powerful happened. This was her moral victory, and no one applauded it. She didn't know who Henry Caldwell was. She didn't know the car he drove or the accounts attached to his name. To her, he was simply another customer who made a choice. And still, she refused to reduce him to that choice. She refused to let frustration turn into ridicule. Have you ever been tempted to speak badly about someone who disappointed you? To make yourself feel better by shrinking them? Lily could have joined the mockery. She had every practical reason to. Rent was overdue. Ethan's inhaler prescription needed refilling by Friday. The $5 could have covered a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. Instead, she separated it from the rest of her tips and placed it in a small side pocket of her apron. Her coworker noticed. "Why aren't you adding it to the jar?" she asked. Lily paused before answering. She lowered her voice, almost as if speaking to herself. "Tips are gifts, not obligations." The words hung quietly in the air. If someone gives what they can, that's theirs to decide. The cook snorted lightly but didn't argue. The younger waitress shook her head. "You're too good for this place." Lily smiled faintly. "No. I'm just trying to be the kind of person I'd want my son to become." That ended the conversation. The mockery faded as quickly as it had begun. Orders resumed. Plates clattered. Life moved forward. Later, when the shift ended and the lights dimmed to their nighttime setting, Lily sat alone at the counter counting her earnings. She organized the bills into careful stacks, her lips moving silently as she totaled them. When she reached the $5 bill, she didn't mix it with the others. She held it for a moment longer than necessary. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. She could justify using it. She needed it. No one would question her integrity for accepting what was technically hers. But something inside her resisted the impulse. It wasn't pride. It was principle. She folded the bill once more and slipped it into the side pocket of her wallet instead of the main compartment. A quiet decision. One no one would notice. "Mom?" Ethan's voice echoed in her memory from earlier that week. "Why do you still smile when people are mean?" She had laughed softly at the time and told him, "Because someone has to break the chain." Sitting there now, she repeated those words silently. Break the chain. Outside, the night air had grown colder. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and gathered her things. As she walked to her car, she noticed the engine hesitating again before finally turning over. She rested her forehead briefly against the steering wheel once it started, whispering a quick prayer of gratitude. $5 could have made that moment slightly easier. It could have bought reassurance in the form of gas. But instead, it became something else entirely, a symbol she didn't yet understand. Across town, in a home lit only by a desk lamp and the faint glow of city lights through tall windows, Henry Caldwell sat in silence. His untouched dinner plate from earlier remained on the kitchen counter. He hadn't bothered turning on the television. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing, replaying the scene in the diner again and again. Her steady gaze. Her refusal to argue. The sentence she delivered without anger. And now, though he hadn't heard the mockery that followed, he could almost imagine it. He had seen that look before, the one co-worker's exchange after a poor tip. Yet something told him she hadn't joined in. He couldn't explain why he believed that. Perhaps it was the consistency in her tone. The absence of performance. He closed his eyes and heard her voice once more. "Kindness isn't measured by how much you give." He rose from his chair and walked toward the piano Margaret once played. His fingers brushed against the keys without pressing them. "You'd have liked her," he murmured into the quiet room, as if his late wife could still hear him. He thought about the times Margaret defended strangers in conversation, offering explanations for behavior others were quick to condemn. "We don't know their story," she used to say. The similarity unsettled him. Because if Lily truly believed what she said, even after being tested, then she represented something he had feared was disappearing from the world. Authentic goodness without an audience. What she didn't know was that somewhere across town, a billionaire replayed her words again and again. He wasn't thinking about $5 anymore. He was thinking about character. About dignity under pressure. About whether he himself had passed the same test. And as the clock ticked past midnight, one question refused to leave him: if kindness is a gift, not an obligation, what does that make the way he had been living? The next morning began like every other, too early and already heavy. Lily woke before her alarm, staring at the ceiling for a few seconds before remembering the numbers she had calculated the night before. Rent. Utilities. Medication. She moved quietly so she wouldn't wake Ethan, but when she opened the apartment door to grab the newspaper, her breath caught. A bright orange notice was taped across the center of the door. Final notice: pay within 72 hours or vacate. The words were printed in bold, impersonal font. No anger. No sympathy. Just policy. Lily peeled it off slowly, her fingers trembling despite her effort to stay steady. For a moment, she leaned her forehead against the doorframe and closed her eyes. 72 hours. 3 days to produce money she did not have. Inside, Ethan's coughing broke the silence. It was sharper than usual. Lily hurried to the kitchen table where his inhaler always rested. She picked it up, shook it gently, then pressed it once into the air. Nothing. She pressed again. A faint, weak puff escaped. Empty. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Mom? Ethan's voice was small from the hallway. She forced calm into her tone. It's okay, sweetheart. We'll pick up a new one today. But she knew the prescription refill wasn't covered until next week. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through her banking app, hoping she had miscalculated. The balance stared back at her, unchanged. Have you ever felt the walls close in all at once, as if life had been waiting for the exact moment you were most fragile? She dressed quickly, folding the eviction notice and sliding it into her purse so Ethan wouldn't see it. Everything good? He asked while eating cereal. She smiled automatically. Everything's fine. The lie tasted bitter, but she swallowed it anyway. After dropping him at school with a promise to bring home his favorite spaghetti for dinner, she walked to her car. The engine sputtered once when she turned the key. Then twice. On the third attempt, it roared weakly to life. Please, she whispered under her breath. The drive to the pharmacy felt longer than usual. When she pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, she sat still for a moment, gathering courage. She stepped inside, asked for the inhaler refill, and listened as the pharmacist explained gently, insurance won't cover it yet. Out of pocket, it'll be $142. The number echoed in her ears. She nodded, pretending to consider it, then stepped aside to let the next customer approach. $142 might as well have been $1,000. She walked back to her car slowly, each step heavier than the last. When she turned the key again, nothing happened. The engine clicked once. Then silence. She tried again. And again. The parking lot seemed suddenly louder, cars passing, doors slamming, people moving forward with their day while hers had stalled completely. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. Not now, she whispered. She tried one more time. The car remained still. That was the moment something inside her cracked. Her breathing grew uneven, shoulders shaking as tears finally spilled over. Not quiet tears. Not the controlled kind she allowed herself at night. This was different. It was the sound of someone who had been strong for too long without pause. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, the horn giving a weak, accidental honk beneath the weight. For a few seconds, she let herself feel it all, the eviction notice, Ethan's empty inhaler, the broken car, the exhaustion of holding everything together with threadbare determination. "I can't do this," she whispered, though there was no one to hear her. The world did not stop for her grief. It simply waited for her to move again. After several minutes, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater and forced herself upright. She opened her wallet to check the remaining cash. Bills folded carefully. Receipts tucked between them. And then she saw it, the $5 bill. Separate from the rest. The one left by the man her coworkers had mocked. For a brief second, her fingers hovered over it. $5 wouldn't fix the car. It wouldn't cover the inhaler. It wouldn't erase the notice taped to her door. But it could buy a little gas. A small meal. Something immediate. No one would blame her. It was hers by custom, even if not by generosity. She closed her eyes, gripping the bill tightly. Survival was loud in her mind, urging practicality over principle. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the $5 bill back into the side pocket of her wallet. Not in the main section. Not to be spent. She inhaled shakily and whispered, almost to remind herself, tips are gifts, not obligations. If she started redefining that now, what else would she compromise when things became harder? Integrity, she realized, is most visible when survival is hardest. She stepped out of the car and called a tow service, knowing the cost would push her further behind. She arranged for Ethan to stay an extra hour at after-school care, even though the additional fee would hurt. She kept moving, because stopping entirely was not an option. That evening, after borrowing a ride from a coworker and finishing another shift with eyes still slightly swollen, she returned home to find the orange eviction notice fluttering slightly against the door in the evening breeze. She removed it again and placed it on the kitchen table, this time not hiding it. Ethan noticed. "Are we moving?" he asked quietly. Lily knelt beside him, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We're figuring things out," she said. He nodded, trusting her completely. That trust weighed more than any bill. She kissed his forehead and sent him to brush his teeth, then sat alone at the table staring at the notice until the numbers blurred. Across town, in a polished office lined with framed patents and awards, Henry Caldwell sat across from his lawyer at 8 o'clock the next morning. The leather folder containing his will lay open between them. "You sounded urgent," the lawyer said cautiously. Henry's expression was unreadable. "I need changes," he replied. "Significant ones." The lawyer adjusted his glasses, surprised. "To the trust allocations?" Henry nodded slowly. "To everything." He thought of the diner. Of the steady voice that defended him even after he failed her. Of the principle that held firm under pressure. "What happened?" the lawyer asked carefully. Henry leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "I met someone," he said. "And I realized I've been measuring the wrong things." But what Henry did the next morning, shocked even his own lawyer. By mid-morning, Henry had postponed 2 board calls and cancelled a lunch with investors. His lawyer left the office unsettled, carrying notes about revisions that would redirect hundreds of millions of dollars. But Henry wasn't finished. Changing documents was easy. Understanding why he felt compelled to change them was harder. He returned home, sat at his desk, and stared at a blank legal pad. One name sat at the top, Lily Carter. He disliked acting on emotion alone. His entire career had been built on verification. Data. Evidence. Patterns. And so, almost instinctively, he began to investigate, not to expose her, not to discredit her, but to confirm that what he witnessed wasn't an isolated performance. He did not send a team in suits. He did not request official background checks that would leave digital footprints. Instead, he asked a retired investigator he trusted, a quiet man named Walter who had once helped him vet executive hires discreetly. "I need to know about a waitress," Henry said simply. Walter raised an eyebrow but didn't ask unnecessary questions. "What am I looking for?" he asked. Henry paused before answering. "Character," he said quietly. "Patterns." Within 48 hours, information began to surface, not scandal, not debt beyond what Henry already suspected, but small stories. The kind that rarely make headlines because they benefit no one except the people directly involved. 3 years earlier, according to the diner's manager, Lily had found a leather wallet left behind in a booth after a busy Sunday brunch. Inside was over $2,000 in cash, along with credit cards and identification belonging to a traveling contractor passing through town. Security footage showed her opening it briefly behind the counter, counting the cash only to verify it was intact, then sealing it inside an envelope. She waited until closing to drive across town to the address on the license. The contractor had answered the door pale with panic, already canceling cards. "You didn't take anything?" he reportedly asked, stunned. Lily had smiled and said, "It wasn't mine. No one had posted about it online. No reward was accepted." The story lived quietly among staff who remembered it as proof she was too honest for her own good. Another detail surfaced from a regular customer, an older woman who visited the diner twice a week. On at least 4 occasions over the past year, Lily had covered the woman's meal anonymously when she noticed her hesitating over prices. She never announced it. She simply adjusted the bill and told the cashier to mark it as house error. When asked why, she reportedly replied, "Dignity matters more than dollars." There were no social media posts documenting these gestures. No attempts to build a reputation. In fact, when co-workers teased her about being overly generous, she brushed it off with the same quiet consistency Henry had witnessed firsthand. She never complained publicly about customers. Even after difficult shifts, even after disrespect, there were no online rants, no sarcastic remarks in the break room beyond normal fatigue. Just steady endurance. Henry read through these findings alone in his study, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Each detail pressed against his chest with increasing weight. This wasn't a single good evening. It was a pattern. A philosophy lived consistently, even when inconvenient. He stood slowly and walked toward the piano again, drawn by memory more than intention. His fingers finally pressed a key this time, the soft note echoing faintly through the room. He remembered Margaret sitting beside him years ago, her voice warm and certain. "The rarest people aren't rich," she had said during a quiet conversation after a charity gala where donors competed for recognition. "They're good." At the time, he had smiled politely, distracted by financial targets and expansion plans. Now the sentence returned with sharp clarity. He lowered himself onto the piano bench, elbows resting on his knees. For the first time in months, his composure fractured. Guilt crept in, not dramatic, not explosive, but steady and undeniable. He had walked into that diner believing he was evaluating someone else's integrity. He had positioned himself as the examiner, the one with power to reward or withhold. Yet every report he read, every small act of unpublicized kindness, suggested something else entirely. Lily had not altered her behavior for approval. She had not performed goodness when watched and withdrawn it when unobserved. She was consistent. And that consistency exposed him. He thought about the $5 bill again. About how easily he had reduced her effort to a test. About how casually he had nodded when she asked if something was wrong. He replayed the moment she defended him against mockery, though he had not heard it. He now knew from Walter's quiet inquiries that she had refused to join co-workers in criticism. "Maybe he's struggling too," she had said. The words felt heavier now. She had granted him empathy he did not deserve in that moment. She had extended grace without context. And he had offered suspicion in return. Henry leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He realized something uncomfortable: he hadn't tested her. She had tested him. Not intentionally. Not strategically. But by remaining who she was under pressure, she forced him to confront who he had become. A man cautious to the point of cynicism. Generous in headlines, skeptical in private. Willing to measure others while avoiding measurement himself. The realization stung because it was true. For years, he had justified emotional distance as wisdom. He had called distrust prudence. He had framed control as responsibility. But watching Lily, and now learning the history behind her quiet decisions, revealed a different standard. He stood abruptly, walking back to his desk. The revised will draft lay open where he had left it. Numbers filled the pages, allocations neatly outlined. Yet the document suddenly felt incomplete again. Money redirected without personal accountability would only repeat old patterns. He picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer once more. "There's another change," he said when the call connected. "I want a clause added. Direct involvement. Site visits. Personal oversight for every major initiative." There was a pause on the other end. "That's unusual," the lawyer replied carefully. Henry's voice softened but did not waver. So was meeting her. As evening settled outside, Henry made one final decision. He would return to the diner, but not to test, not to observe from a distance. He needed to face the imbalance he had created. He needed to answer the unspoken question that lingered since the night before. If kindness is measured by how you treat people when no one is watching, then who was he when the world wasn't applauding? And more importantly, who did he want to be now? The next evening, just before the dinner rush began, the bell above the diner door rang again. This time, a few heads turned immediately. Henry Caldwell stepped inside wearing the same worn jacket, the same quiet posture. He did not announce himself. He did not look around for recognition. But recognition found him anyway. The younger waitress from the previous night nudged the cashier subtly. "That's him," she whispered. $5 guy. The label had already formed. Henry heard it, though he pretended not to. He walked to the same booth and sat down, folding his hands on the table. His expression was calm, but inside, his pulse felt heavier than it had in years. The manager, a broad-shouldered man named Carl who prided himself on protecting his staff, approached before Lily could reach the table. "Evening," Carl said, voice polite but firm. "Just so we're clear, we value our employees here. If there was an issue with service last night, I'd appreciate hearing it directly." The message was layered but unmistakable. Henry looked up slowly. "There was no issue," he replied evenly. Carl crossed his arms slightly. "Because leaving what you left suggests otherwise." A few customers nearby began to sense tension. The room quieted in subtle waves. Henry could feel the weight of collective judgment pressing against him. He had faced aggressive shareholders and hostile negotiations without flinching, yet this small-town confrontation unsettled him in a way boardrooms never had. Before the moment could escalate, Lily stepped forward from behind the counter. "It's okay," she said gently, positioning herself between Carl and Henry. Her voice carried enough clarity to reach surrounding tables. "Sir, you're always welcome here. You don't owe us anything." The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silence spread outward from it. Carl blinked, surprised. "Lily," he began, but she shook her head slightly. "Tips are voluntary," she continued calmly. "We serve because it's our job. What someone leaves, or doesn't leave, is their decision." There was no sarcasm in her tone. No martyrdom. Just principle. Henry felt something tighten in his throat. The younger waitress looked confused. But Lily cut in softly, not harshly. "We don't know what people carry when they walk in here." She turned her attention fully to Henry now. "And we don't measure worth by one moment." Customers who had only half listened before were now fully attentive. A man at the counter set down his fork. A woman near the window leaned back slightly in her seat. The diner, usually loud with overlapping conversations, held a fragile stillness. Henry hadn't expected defense. He hadn't expected protection. Especially not in public. Especially not after intentionally placing her in an uncomfortable position the night before. He cleared his throat, but no words came immediately. For the first time in a long time, he felt stripped of the advantage wealth often provided. There was no title here. No headline preceding his name. Just a man standing in front of someone who had every reason to resent him, and chose not to. "Thank you," he managed quietly. Lily gave a small nod and motioned toward the booth. "Would you like your usual coffee?" she asked, as if resetting the moment back to normalcy. The simplicity of that question shook him more than confrontation would have. She was offering him dignity in front of others, restoring balance he had disrupted. He sat down slowly, aware that the room was still watching. Carl stepped back, uncertain but respectful of Lily's stance. The murmurs gradually resumed. Plates clinked again. Conversations picked up, though more subdued. Lily brought the coffee and placed it gently in front of him. When she did, their eyes met briefly. There was no triumph in hers. No expectation. Just steady presence. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the cup. He realized he was not being tested now. He was being trusted. And trust felt heavier than accusation. He spoke quietly so only she could hear at first. "Why would you defend me?" Lily tilted her head slightly, as if the question puzzled her. "Because fairness isn't selective," she replied. Then, louder, clear enough for those nearby to hear, she added, "Everyone deserves respect. Even when we don't understand them." The word settled into the room with unmistakable weight. Henry inhaled slowly, feeling something shift permanently inside him. Respect. Not because he had earned it. Not because he had paid for it. But because she believed in offering it as a baseline. He stood abruptly, not out of anger, but because sitting suddenly felt impossible. The room quieted again, sensing something significant unfolding. Henry looked around at the faces watching him, workers, families, regulars. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. Then he looked back at Lily. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steadier than he expected. "There's something you should know," he began. A pause followed. The kind that stretches long enough to alter direction. Lily remained still, attentive but unafraid. But the words she said next would rewrite history. 3 days after the confrontation, Lily received a call during her afternoon break. The voice on the other end was formal, measured. "Miss Carter, Mr. Henry Caldwell would like to request your presence at his attorney's office this Friday at 10 a.m. The words alone were enough to drain the color from her face. Attorney's office. Request your presence. Her mind moved quickly to worst-case scenarios. Had she said something inappropriate in front of customers? Was the diner being threatened legally? Was this about the public exchange? She thanked the caller politely, wrote down the address with slightly trembling fingers, and ended the call. For the rest of her shift, she moved on autopilot. "You okay?" her coworker asked quietly. Lily forced a nod. "Just tired." Friday morning arrived faster than she wanted. She wore her only formal blouse, the one she had kept from a previous job interview years ago. She arranged childcare for Ethan, telling him she had an important meeting. The building she entered was tall and intimidating, all glass panels and polished floors. Nothing like the diner's cracked vinyl booths. When the receptionist directed her upstairs, her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Henry was already seated inside the conference room when she entered, dressed simply, not in a tailored suit but in a neutral gray jacket. He stood when she walked in. "Thank you for coming," he said gently. She remained cautious. "Is something wrong?" she asked immediately. The lawyer cleared his throat and gestured for her to sit. "Miss Carter, Mr. Caldwell has made recent amendments to his estate planning documents. The phrasing felt distant, technical. Lily's fingers tightened around her purse strap. Estate planning? She glanced at Henry, confusion written openly across her face. The lawyer continued, unfolding a printed document. Effective immediately, a trust has been established to cover the full cost of your son Ethan's education through graduate school, should he choose to pursue it. Lily blinked once, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The lawyer repeated it calmly. "Additionally, arrangements have been made to eliminate the remaining balance on your current housing situation and transition it into secured ownership." The room felt unsteady. "I don't understand," Lily said, her voice barely above a breath. The lawyer continued reading. "A healthcare trust has also been created to ensure uninterrupted medical coverage for Ethan's asthma treatment and related needs." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall yet. She turned toward Henry, searching for explanation. "Why?" The question held no accusation, only disbelief. Henry met her gaze steadily. "Because you reminded me of something I forgot," he said quietly. The lawyer paused, then added, "However, Ms. Carter, there is an important clarification. No direct cash disbursement will be issued to you personally." For a split second, Lily felt relief mixed with confusion. She had never wanted a handout. The lawyer continued, his tone precise. "Instead, Mr. Caldwell has established a charitable foundation in your name." He turned the document slightly so she could see the heading printed clearly across the top. "The Quiet Kindness Initiative." The words looked surreal in bold lettering. "This foundation will fund community-based assistance programs, rent relief, medical support, food stability, operating locally first, with potential expansion." Lily's hand moved slowly to her mouth. "In my name?" she asked softly. Henry spoke now, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You said tips are gifts, not obligations. You defended me when you didn't have to. You live your principles even when they cost you." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "I don't want to give you something that ends with you. I want to give you something that begins because of you." Lily's composure finally broke. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not loud, not dramatic, just steady and overwhelmed. "I'm just a waitress," she said faintly. Henry shook his head. "You're consistent. That's rarer." The lawyer resumed, outlining governance details, oversight boards, annual funding allocations drawn from Henry's estate. Lily listened in fragments. College secured. Home secured. Healthcare secured. But more than that, her quiet philosophy, once confined to a roadside diner, now had infrastructure behind it. She looked down at the document again. The Quiet Kindness Initiative. It didn't feel like ownership. It felt like responsibility. "I don't know how to run a foundation," she admitted honestly. Henry allowed himself a small smile. "You've been running one your whole life," he replied. "This just gives it resources." In that moment, Lily understood something important. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It wasn't a reward handed to her for endurance. It was a structure designed to multiply what she already practiced privately. She thought about the elderly couple counting coins. The truck driver eating pie. The wallet returned untouched. All those quiet acts had seemed small at the time. Temporary. Now they were part of something larger than either of them. Henry leaned forward slightly. "You won't owe me anything," he said firmly. "No publicity tours. No speeches unless you choose to give them. This exists because goodness should outlive us." Narration slows here, because what happened in that office was more than financial restructuring. It was transformation. He didn't just reward her kindness, he made it permanent. Henry sank into the leather chair opposite Lily, the office quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside the tall windows. His hands rested on the polished mahogany desk, fingers loosely clasped, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to hide the fatigue behind his posture or his gaze. "I suppose I should explain," he began, voice low, measured. "Not that it excuses anything I did, or the way I approached you." He paused, eyes dropping to the surface of the desk. "My children," he said slowly, "they've always seen me as a bank, not a person. Every conversation, every visit, seemed to carry the unspoken question, what will I inherit?" He swallowed hard. "After Margaret passed, I realized I'd spent decades measuring people by what they could give me, rather than what they could give the world. Or themselves." He looked up, meeting Lily's eyes for the first time directly, and there was no judgment there, only truth. "My wife used to say something to me," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "You'll know a person's heart," she told me, "when they think no one important is watching." His lips trembled as he exhaled slowly. "I left $5 on purpose," he whispered, barely audible. "Because I needed to know, if kindness still existed. If it could survive outside expectation. Outside recognition. And you proved that it could." Lily listened quietly, shoulders relaxed, her expression steady, yet soft. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak immediately. Then, gently, she leaned forward and repeated the line he had not forgotten since that first night, "Kindness isn't about the amount. It's about the intention." The words landed with quiet force, punctuating everything Henry had felt but could not articulate. He closed his eyes, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing. He could no longer hold back the tears that had been gathering for years, silent, unacknowledged, private. One fell down his cheek. Then another. No sound escaped him. He cried quietly, not for money, not for loss, not for recognition. He cried because the world had reminded him that goodness could still exist. And that, in the simplest acts, he had found the reflection of what he had longed for most, human decency, unmeasured, unperforming, uncorrupted. For the first time in a long time, he felt a measure of peace. Weeks later, the apartment was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. Ethan, his small chest steady and untroubled, inhaled smoothly through his new treatment, the medication finally regulating each breath. Lily sat beside him at the kitchen table, notebook open, balancing schedules for foundation initiatives, calls with volunteers, and planning community programs. Every so often, she would glance at the $5 bill tucked safely in her wallet, still untouched, but now a symbol rather than a lifeline. Through the Quiet Kindness initiative, she began quietly helping others, paying medical bills for struggling families, covering groceries for single parents, and mentoring young teens learning responsibility. Her impact rippled outward, not loud or flashy, just steady and consistent, like her own quiet integrity. Henry returned to the diner one afternoon, unannounced, slipping in as if he were just another customer. He didn't test anyone this time. He simply sat at the counter with his coffee, observing from a distance, letting the scene unfold naturally. Lily moved past him with a smile, greeting customers, refilling cups, and handling orders with the same calm, unshakable dignity. He realized then that he had already been changed, by someone who never sought recognition, never performed kindness, yet held unwavering strength in her principles. The world outside the diner continued at its usual pace, but inside, something profound had shifted between them, invisible yet undeniable. That day, the billionaire didn't change her life. She changed his. And the question lingers with all of us, what would you have done if you were in Lily's position? Would you have kept the $5, or given it back? Think about it. Reflect on it. Because sometimes, the smallest acts reveal the deepest truths. If this story stayed with you, leave a like so more people can hear it. And subscribe for more powerful true stories every week.